There is a terror that exists only in silence, a fear so specific and absolute that it turns the very act of breathing into a gamble. Imagine, if you will, that your skin is not skin but a thin, brittle casing of spun crystal. Imagine that your bones are not marrow and calcium but delicate flutes of blown glass, cooling and hardening in the winter air. To sit is to risk a fracture. To walk is to invite shattering. To be touched by another human hand, even a hand of love, is to face annihilation. This was the prison of Charles VI, the King of France. He sat upon a throne of solid oak and velvet, surrounded by ironclad knights and stone walls, yet in his mind he was more fragile than a windowpane trembling in a storm. The year is 1392, and the kingdom of France is a tapestry beginning to fray at the seams. But the truest unraveling is taking place within the skull of its monarch. We often look at history through the lens of battles, treaties, and lines on a map. We measure power in armies and gold. But the story of the Glass King forces us to look inward, into the terrifying geography of the human mind. It asks us to consider what happens when the architect of a nation loses the blueprint of his own reality. Charles was not born a monster, nor was he born a fool. He was christened Le Bien-Aimé, the Beloved. He was the golden son of the Valois dynasty, a young man of promise, vigor, and charm. The people cheered when his shadow fell upon the cobblestones of Paris. They saw in him the strength of Charlemagne and the piety of St. Louis. But the mind is a castle with many rooms, and some doors are best left locked. When the key turned for Charles, it did not open onto a world of logic, but onto a landscape of nightmares where the dead walked, where friends became assassins, and where his own body transformed into a vessel of excruciating fragility. Why does this story haunt us across the chasm of 6 centuries? Perhaps because it is the ultimate paradox. The most powerful man in Europe, who could command thousands to die for him, was paralyzed by the fear of a single embrace. He wrapped himself in blankets reinforced with iron ribs to protect his glass ribs. He refused to wash, lest the water dissolve him. He forgot his name, his wife, and his children, fleeing from them like a wounded animal into the dark corners of the Hotel St. Paul. This is not merely a chronicle of madness. It is a tragedy of a kingdom held hostage by a phantom. As the king's mind splintered, so too did France. While he cowered in the shadows, wolves circled the throne, greedy uncles, a cunning brother, and a cold queen, tearing the realm apart in a civil war that would pave the road for the English invasion. The shards of Charles's sanity became the weapons that bled France dry. The corridors of the Louvre are dark, and the wind is howling outside the palace walls. If you wish to walk with us through the shattered mirror of the past, stay close. Keep the candle lit. Chapter 1: The Golden Boy of Valois. To understand the shard, we must first understand the vase before it fell. We must look at the glass when it was whole, flawless, and catching the light of a desperate kingdom. Long before the darkness descended, Charles VI was not a figure of pity, but of blinding, incandescent hope. The year is 1380. The location is the Cathedral of Reims, the spiritual womb of the French monarchy. Imagine the sound of 1,000 voices rising in the Te Deum, vibrating against the ancient limestone walls until the very dust seems to dance. The air is heavy, suffocatingly sweet with the scent of frankincense, and the unwashed bodies of the nobility squeezed into their finest velvets. In the center of this sensory storm stands a boy. He is barely 12 years old. His hair is the color of spun flax, his eyes clear and wide, drinking in the spectacle of his own ascension. He is fair of face, possessed of a delicate, almost feminine beauty that belies the strength of the bloodline coursing through his veins. When the archbishop lowers the heavy gold crown of Charlemagne onto his head, it slips down over his brow, too large for a child's skull. The court holds its breath, but the boy does not buckle. He straightens his neck. He accepts the weight, and in that moment the people of France, starved by decades of war and plague, look at him and see not a child but a savior. They christen him Charles Le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. France at this moment is a wounded animal. The 100 Years' War has dragged its bloody claws across the countryside for generations. The English hold Calais and Bordeaux. The countryside is ravaged by routiers, mercenary bands who burn and pillage for sport. The treasury is empty, drained by the boy's father, Charles V, in his obsession with libraries and fortresses. The people are tired. They are hungry. They look to this golden child as one looks to the first break of sun after a month of winter storms. They believe that his youth is a promise of renewal, a clean slate upon which the glory of the Valois can be rewritten. But a boy king is a dangerous thing. A child on the throne creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, especially political nature. Hovering behind the young monarch like gargoyles detached from the cathedral eaves stand his uncles. They are the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon. They are men of immense power, immense greed, and very little conscience. To them, Charles is not a savior, he is an opportunity. He is a signature to be guided, a treasury key to be turned. As the coronation oil dries on the boy's forehead, the uncles are already carving up the kingdom, raising taxes to fund their own private wars and opulent lifestyles. For the first 8 years of his reign, Charles lives in a gilded cage constructed by his own blood. He grows from a beautiful child into a handsome, athletic young man. He loves the hunt, the feel of a lance in his hand, the rush of the wind in his face as he rides through the forests of Campigny. He is physically robust, seemingly immune to the rot that infests the politics of his court. He dresses in silks embroidered with pearls. He dances until dawn. He feasts on swan and venison. He is the sun around which the court orbits, but he is a sun eclipsed by the shadows of his guardians. Yet even in the brightness of his youth there are whispers, quiet, terrified murmurs in the back corridors of the Louvre. The servants speak of his mother, Joanna of Bourbon, a woman of fragile spirit who spent months in darkened rooms, weeping over terrors only she could see. They speak of the Valois madness, a spectral inheritance that lies dormant in the blood, waiting for a trigger. But looking at Charles, glowing with health and vitality, sword in hand, laughing with his knights, such dark talk seems like treasonous gossip. He is the picture of sanity. He is the picture of a king. But the blood of kings is not easily diluted by the ink of bureaucrats. A lion cub may be kept in a cage of gold, fed by the hands of keepers, but eventually the mane grows, and the roar begins to rumble in the chest. For 8 years Charles watched. He watched his uncle, the Duke of Burgundy, drain the royal coffers to fund his opulent court in Dijon. He watched the Duke of Berry strip the peasantry of their last coins to build castles that rivaled the heavens. He saw the discontent simmering in the streets of Paris, the way the cheers for the beloved were beginning to sour into the grumbles of the starving. And slowly, quietly, the boy decided to become a man. The moment of fracture, the first crack in the uncle's power, not the king's mind, arrived on All Saints' Day in 1388. The setting was the archbishop's palace in Reims, the very room where the oil had first touched his brow. The air was cold, the stone floors exhaling the chill of the coming winter. Charles, now 20 years old, summoned the council. His uncles sat around the heavy oak table, complacent in their velvet robes, expecting another rubber stamp on their decrees, another levy to be signed by their puppet. Charles stood. He did not shout. He did not draw a sword. He simply spoke with a calm, crystalline clarity that silenced the room. "Thank you, my dear uncles," he said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "for the trouble and toil you have taken in my affairs. But I am of age now. I will govern my kingdom alone." The silence that followed was louder than any cannon blast. It was the sound of power shifting, the tectonic plates of the realm grinding against one another. The uncles, purple with rage but bound by the ancient laws of succession, had no choice but to bow. They gathered their retinues and rode away, exiled from the heart of power, leaving behind a young king who stood alone in the center of the room, holding the weight of France in his own 2 hands. With the parasites removed, the king recalled his father's old advisors. The nobles mocked them, calling them the marmosets, the little monkeys or grotesque statues found on church pillars, because they were men of lesser birth, lawyers and clerics who rose by merit rather than blood, but to the people they were saviors. Under the guidance of the Marmosets, the taxes were lowered. Justice returned to the courts. The golden sun of the Valois seemed to shine brighter than ever. Paris became a playground of pageantry. There were tournaments where armor shone like polished mirrors, feasts where wine flowed from fountains, and nights where the music never ceased. Charles was the center of it all, tireless, exuberant, dancing until his feet bled, hunting until his horses collapsed. But look closer at the portrait. Step past the velvet ropes and the cheering crowds. There is a frantic energy to his rule, a vibration that feels less like vitality and more like fever. He is too bright. He moves too fast. It is as if he is running a race against an invisible shadow, trying to outpace a darkness he can feel breathing against the back of his neck. In the spring of 1392, the first true tremor shook the ground. The king fell ill with a fever and a sickness of the brain. For days he lay in a darkened room, delirious, his body burning with a heat that defied the physician's poultices. The court held its breath, remembering his mother's madness, remembering the fragility of the line, but the fever broke. Charles rose from his bed, seemingly whole. He brushed off the concern of his doctors. He laughed at the whispers. He was the beloved. He was invincible. Yet something had shifted behind his eyes. A door had been jarred open just a fraction. He became prone to sudden, violent rages. He was easily agitated by loud noises or sudden movements. The golden glass of his mind had not yet shattered, but it had developed a spiderweb fracture, invisible to the naked eye, waiting for the single, sharp blow that would bring the whole structure crashing down. That blow would not come from a weapon of war. It would come from the sun itself. Chapter 2. The Forest of Shadows. August 1392 does not arrive softly. It descends upon France like a judgment. The sun is no longer a crown upon the heavens but a hammer, beating against the anvil of the earth with a white, blinding fury. We find the king's army marching west, leaving the stone safety of Le Mans, heading toward Brittany. They are on a mission of vengeance. A failed assassination attempt against the king's beloved constable, Olivier de Clisson, has sent Charles into a fury that mirrors the heat of the season. He is obsessed. He is driven. He is riding into the furnace of his own undoing. The forest of Le Mans is usually a place of shade and respite, where ancient oaks weave a canopy against the sky. But today, the trees offer no comfort. They stand like silent sentinels, trapping the heat, turning the road into a stifling tunnel of dust and dead air. The atmosphere is thick enough to choke on. It smells of horse sweat, of greased leather, of hot iron, and of men slowly baking inside their shells of armor. The drone of cicadas is ceaseless, a high-pitched scream that drills into the skull, mirroring the tinnitus of a migraine. And in the center of this sweltering column rides the king. He is dressed not for the weather but for his station, draped in heavy black velvet that absorbs the sun, turning his body into a kiln. He has been unwell. Since the fever in Amiens he has been pale, his moods shifting like the tides. On this day he rides alone, separated from his squires by a few paces, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent, feverish conversation with unseen ghosts. The vibration of the march, the rhythmic thud of hooves, the clatter of scabbards, the creak of saddles, seems to agitate him. He looks at the dark spaces between the trees with suspicion. Then the first omen appears. From the tangled undergrowth a figure bursts forth. He is a ragged thing, barefoot and wild-haired, a specter of poverty amidst the procession of gold. Historians call him a madman, folklore calls him a leper. He rushes toward the king's horse, seizing the bridle with a hand that looks like a claw. The royal guards, sluggish in the heat, are too slow to intercept him. The man's eyes are wide, burning with a terrifying lucidity. He does not beg for coin. He delivers a prophecy. "Ride no further, noble king," he screams, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Turn back, you are betrayed." The words hang in the stagnant air. The guards descend upon the wretch, beating him back with the shafts of their spears, but they do not kill him. Perhaps they are too exhausted. Perhaps they, too, feel the uncanny weight of the moment. The man is dragged away, his cries fatting into the forest, but the damage is done. The seed has been planted in the fertile, fevered soil of Charles's mind. Betrayed. The word echoes in the rhythm of the hooves. Betrayed, betrayed. The king shudders. He looks at his uncles riding ahead. He looks at his brother, Louis of Orleans. The faces of his kin suddenly look like the masks of assassins. The forest closes in. They continue the march. They emerge from the shade of the woods into a sandy clearing where the sun strikes the earth with unchecked violence. It is noon. The heat is absolute. The world is washed out, colorless and shimmering. The king is swaying in his saddle, sweat soaking the velvet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The line between the external world and the internal nightmare is thinning. The glass is beginning to vibrate. Behind the king, a young page, overcome by the heat and the hypnotic rhythm of the march, nods off in his saddle. His grip slackens. The heavy steel lance he is carrying slips from his hand. It falls. It strikes the helmet of another page. Clang! The sound of steel striking steel is sharp, dissonant, and terribly final. In a normal world, it is the sound of clumsiness, a dropped lance, a moment of embarrassment for a tired page. But inside the skull of Charles VI, it is not a mistake. It is a signal. It is the click of the assassin's lock turning. It is the confirmation of the leper's prophecy, the realization of the whispers, the thunderclap that shatters the fragile dam holding back the ocean of his paranoia. The king's head snaps up. His eyes are no longer the eyes of the beloved. They are the eyes of a cornered animal, wide, white-trimmed, and void of recognition. The world slows down. The heat waves shimmering off the road transform the nights around him into distorted monsters. The friendly faces of his retinue twist into the sneers of traitors. He draws his sword. The blade hisses as it leaves the scabbard, catching the brutal noon sun and flashing like a shard of lightning. "Forward against the traitors," he screams, a sound torn from a raw throat. "They wish to deliver me to the enemy." Before anyone can breathe, he spurs his horse. He charges not at a phantom enemy but at his own brother, Louis of Orleans. The Duke of Orleans, young and arrogant, freezes in disbelief as his sovereign bears down on him with murder in his eyes. He wheels his horse at the last second, and the king's blade slices the air where his neck had been a heartbeat before. The king does not stop. He turns his fury on the nearest figures, his own bodyguards, the men sworn to die for him. It is a massacre of confusion. The knights cannot draw their weapons against God's anointed. They can only dodge, parry with their shields, and shout for reason. But there is no reason here. Charles strikes the bastard of Polignac, cutting him down. He strikes 3 others. The sand of the road turns red. The air is filled with the shouts of men and the screaming of horses, a chaotic swirling of dust and violence under the indifferent sun. For an hour, the King of France wages war against his own shadow. He is a whirlwind of steel, exhausted, sweating, foaming at the mouth, swinging until his arm is heavy as lead. Finally, his strength fails. The adrenaline crash leaves him gasping. His chamberlain, Guillaume Martel, seizes the moment. He leaps from his horse and wraps his arms around the king from behind, pinning the royal arms to his sides. Other knights rush in, grabbing the bridle, pulling the sword from his cramping fingers. They wrestle him from the saddle and lay him gently on the grass. The fury vanishes as quickly as it came, replaced by a terrifying stillness. Charles's eyes roll back into his head. He does not speak. He does not recognize the men weeping over him. He lies in the dust, his velvet robe stained with the sweat of madness and the blood of his servants. The uncles gather around the fallen monarch, their faces masks of shock, but their eyes calculating. The Duke of Berry looks down at the comatose form of his nephew and speaks the epitaph of the Golden Age. "We must return to Paris. The king is mad." They lash him to a wagon like a prisoner or a corpse. The journey back to the city is a funeral procession for the living. The people who line the roads do not cheer. They cross themselves and turn away. The sun has set on the beloved. The glass has cracked and the shards are beginning to fall. Chapter 3. The Ball of Ash and Bone. Time is a cruel physician. It often heals the surface while leaving the bone beneath shattered. 6 months pass after the massacre in the forest. The king has returned to Paris, drifting in and out of a gray fugue, his mind a landscape of fog where memory refuses to take root. The court, terrified of the silence, decides that the cure for madness is distraction. They believe that if they can fill the king's eyes with enough color, his ears with enough music, and his goblet with enough wine, the demons will retreat back into the shadows. And so, the Hotel St. Paul becomes a carnival. It is a desperate, frantic gaiety, a dance on the edge of a precipice. On January 28, 1393, the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, organizes a grand celebration. It is a wedding feast for one of her ladies-in-waiting, but the true guest of honor is the king's melancholy. To amuse him, a noble suggests a charivari, a rowdy, subversive masquerade rooted in folklore. The idea is to dress as Homs sauvages, wild men of the woods, mythical beasts of hair and fury who represent the untamed chaos of nature. It is a game of identity, a chance for the king to shed his heavy crown and become, for one night, a creature without memory. But the preparations for this game are sewn with the thread of disaster. The costumes are not made of fur or heavy wool. They are linen bodysuits, tight-fitting and soaked in resin, pitch, and wax to hold the frayed strands of hemp and flax that simulate the wild man's hair. Pitch, resin, wax, these are not fabrics, they are accelerants. The king and 5 of his closest noble companions are stitched into these suits. They are sealed inside. Once the needle finishes its work, there is no quick escape. They are walking torches, waiting for a flame. A warning is issued. The king's uncle, the Duke of Berry, a man prudent enough to fear the combination of fire and flax, orders that no torches be brought into the hall while the dancers are performing. The room is to be lit only by the distant chandeliers hanging high above, casting a dim, safe gloom over the festivities. The stage is set. The musicians strike up a primal, rhythmic beat. The heavy oak doors swing open. 6 shaggy monsters burst into the hall. They howl, they leap. They rattle the chains that bind them together. The court shrieks in delighted terror, not knowing which of the savage beasts is their sovereign. It is a moment of pure, ecstatic release. For the first time in months, Charles feels the weight lift. He is anonymous. He is wild. He separates himself from the other 5 dancers, moving toward the ladies, teasing his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry. He is laughing. The nightmare of the forest feels a lifetime away. But tragedy often arrives in the guise of curiosity. Enter Louis, the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, the man Charles had nearly killed in the forest. He arrives late, flushed with wine, accompanied by his uncle, the Duke of Burgundy. They have missed the order about the torches. They enter the darkened hall and see the spectacle of the wild men dancing. Louis, arrogant and reckless, wants to know who hides beneath the hemp. He grabs a torch from a servant. He steps onto the dance floor. He leans in close, too close, the flame flickering inches from the highly flammable flax. "Who are you?" he whispers, drunkenly peering at the dancers. A stray spark, a drop of hot pitch, it takes less than a heartbeat. The flax catches. It does not smolder, it detonates. The dancer nearest to the torch erupts into a pillar of flame. The fire, hungry and fed by the resin, leaps instantly to the others chained alongside him. The laughter of the court dies in a collective gasp, replaced by a sound that will haunt the history of France forever: the high, thin screaming of men burning alive inside their own clothes. Fire is a voracious listener. It consumes every scream and demands more. Within seconds, the Hotel St. Paul is transformed from a palace of delight into an abattoir. The resin-soaked linen acts like a second skin, melting and fusing to the flesh beneath. The 4 dancers linked together are trapped in a radiant, writhing knot of agony. They spin not out of joy, but out of the primal, frantic need to escape the flames eating them alive. The pitch boils. The wax drips like molten tears. The air fills with the sickening, sweet stench of roasting meat, a smell that the courtiers, paralyzed in their finery, will never scrub from their memories. Charles is just feet away from the inferno. He freezes, his mind snapping back to the forest, the heat, the violence. He is a child again watching the world burn, but salvation comes in the form of heavy velvet. The Duchess of Berry, barely 15 years old but possessed of a terrifying presence of mind, recognizes the king. She does not scream. She does not flee. She grabs him. She pulls him to the floor and throws the vast, heavy folds of her skirt over him. Under the tent of her gown there is darkness. There is the smell of lavender sachet and the muffled sounds of hell breaking loose outside. Charles huddles there, trembling, pressed against the floorboards, listening to the death cries of his friends. He is the King of France, the anointed of God, yet he is reduced to a frightened animal hiding in the dark womb of a woman's dress, shielded from the fire by layers of fabric and gold thread. He survives because he is hidden. He survives because he is small. Outside the Duchess's skirts, the horror plays out to its grim conclusion. One dancer, the Sieur de Nantouillet, manages to break free from the burning circle. He sprints across the hall, a human torch, and flings himself into a large wooden vat of water used to cool the wine bottles. The hiss of steam is the only note of mercy in the cacophony. He survives, scarred and shivering. The others are not so lucky. They burn until they fall, and they burn after they fall. The masquerade ends in a pile of ash and blackened bone on the parquet floor. When the flames are finally smothered and the smoke clears, the silence that descends is heavy enough to crush the lungs. The Duchess lifts her skirt. Charles emerges, pale as a ghost, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looks at the charred remains of the men he had laughed with only moments before. He looks at his brother, Louis of Orleans, who stands holding the extinguished torch, his face a mask of drunken horror and dawning guilt. The king does not rage. He does not weep. He simply stares, his mind retreating further and further away from a reality that is too painful to touch. The Bal des Ardents, the ball of the burning men, broke something in Charles that the forest had only cracked. The public penance that followed was a hollow theater. The king and his brother rode through the streets of Paris to Notre Dame, barefoot and humble, begging God for forgiveness. The people watched in sullen silence. They saw a king who brought fire and death to his own court. They saw a dynasty that seemed cursed by God. But for Charles, the trauma went deeper than guilt. The fire had shown him the ultimate fragility of the human form. He had seen how easily flesh melts, how quickly a man can be reduced to dust. He began to feel a change in his own physiology. If he was not flesh, then he could not burn. If he was not bone, he could not break unless he shattered. The heat of the fire had fused the shards of his mind into a new, terrifying shape. He was no longer just a madman. He was becoming glass. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Fragility. The fire at the ball did not merely burn the skin of the dancers. It seemed to melt the very logic of the king's soul. Heat, when applied to sand, creates glass. And so, in the cooling aftermath of the tragedy, as the smell of ash was scrubbed from the parquet floors of the Hotel St. Paul, Charles VI underwent a transmutation that no alchemist could have predicted. He did not emerge from his trauma hardened like iron. He emerged transparent. He emerged brittle. The Glass Delusion, what later chroniclers would call tegmine vitrio, descended upon him not as a sudden madness, but as a terrifying, undeniable physical reality. To the courtiers watching him from the corners of the room, the king appeared merely eccentric. He moved with a strange, gliding caution, avoiding the edges of tables and the frames of doors. He stood in the center of rooms, arms held slightly away from his body as if balancing on a wire. But inside the king's mind, the sensation was absolute. He could feel the change in his marrow. His femur was no longer a sturdy beam of bone. It was a flute of spun crystal, hollow and singing with tension. His ribs were not a cage of calcium, but thin, curved panes of silica, terrifyingly delicate, barely holding back the pressure of his own beating heart. Imagine the horror of gravity to a man made of glass. To sit down was not a moment of rest. It was a calculated risk of shattering. The throne, with its hard oak seat and velvet cushion, became a hammer waiting to strike. Charles began to refuse to sit. He would stand for hours, trembling, sweat cooling on his brow, terrified that the simple act of bending his knees would cause his legs to snap with the sound of a dropped goblet. When exhaustion finally forced him down, He did so with the agonizing slowness of a man lowering a heavy mirror onto a stone floor, inch by inch, breath held tight in his crystal chest. He ceased to be a predator of the forest and became the prey of physics. He forbade his servants to touch him. When the valets approached to dress him, he recoiled, screaming that their rough hands would crush him. "Do not come near," he would cry, shrinking into the shadows of his bed curtains. "I am brittle, I will break." The embrace of his wife, Queen Isabel, once a source of comfort, became a source of mortal terror. A hug was no longer an act of love, it was an assassination attempt. He saw in her arms the crushing force of a vice, threatening to reduce him to a pile of glittering shards on the royal carpet. To survive this fragile existence, the king became his own architect. He summoned his tailors, not for silks or brocades, but for armor against the world. He ordered a peculiar wardrobe to be constructed, garments reinforced with iron rods. These were not the plates of a knight, but hidden skeletons sewn into the lining of his robes. Iron ribs ran down his sides, iron staves protected his thighs. He wrapped himself in this metal cage, a secret scaffolding designed to hold his glass body together should the world bump against him. He wore these heavy, sweltering clothes day and night, a prisoner inside a fortress of wool and steel. The tragedy of the Glass King lies in the lucidity of his fear. He was not hallucinating dragons or demons. He was hallucinating his own mortality, distilled into a single, poetic metaphor. He looked at his hand and saw the veins like blue cracks in a porcelain cup. He felt the wind and feared it would vibrate him to pieces. He was the most powerful man in Christendom, yet he was held hostage by the physics of a window pane. If the iron ribs were the king's armor, then filth became his mortar. To a man made of glass, the act of bathing is not a cleansing ritual, it is a flirtation with disaster. Water is heavy. Water creates slick surfaces where a foot might slip and a hip might shatter. And so, Charles VI, the anointed sovereign of France, refused the bath. He refused to change his linen. For 5 months, he lived inside his reinforced clothing, allowing the sweat, the grime, and the refuse of his body to accumulate in the folds of his velvet. He became a king of dirt, sitting in the center of a gilded room, his smell radiating outward like a physical barrier, keeping the court at bay more effectively than any guard. The palace physicians looked on in horror. These were men of the Sorbonne, learned in the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, but they were cartographers trying to map a landscape that did not exist. They saw the madness as a blockage of the humors, a surplus of black bile rising from the spleen to cloud the brain. They did not see the glass. They prescribed treatments that were indistinguishable from torture. They bored holes into the king's skull, trepanation, hopping to release the pressure of the demons they believed were trapped inside. They fed him pulverized pearls and gold dust, grinding down the precious stones of the earth to cure the precious stone of his body. But how do you cure a man who believes he is already broken? When the doctors approached him with their lancets and their potions, Charles would scream in terror. He did not fear the pain, he feared the pressure. He feared that their grip would crush his crystalline arms. In his lucid moments, which were becoming rarer, he would weep softly, looking at his hands with a mixture of awe and revulsion, tracing the blue veins that he was convinced were cracks spreading through his glaze. The tragedy of the glass delusion is that it is a disease of isolation. A man made of glass cannot be held. He cannot be comforted. To love him is to endanger him. Queen Isabel, initially sympathetic, found herself pushed to the margins of his life. She became a stranger to her husband, a threat to his structural integrity. When she entered the room, he would not see his wife, he would see a hammer. He began to deny his own name. "Who is this Charles?" he would mutter, scraping at the lice that infested his beard. "I am not Charles, my name is George, I have no kingdom, I have no wife, I am nothing but a vessel waiting to fall." The court watched this degradation with a mix of pity and opportunism. A king who thinks he is glass is a king who cannot hold a sword. He cannot sign a treaty. He cannot lead a charge. He is a ghost haunting his own throne room. And while Charles focused all his energy on keeping his body whole, the body of France began to crack. The iron rods in his clothes could hold his ribs together, but they could not hold the kingdom together. The wolves were gathering at the door, sniffing the air, smelling the weakness of a monarch who was too terrified to move. Chapter 5. The Wolf and the Queen. When the sun is eclipsed, the stars do not weep, they burn brighter in the stolen darkness. With Charles VI retreating into the fragile sanctuary of his Glass Delusion, the throne of France became a vacuum. And in the physics of power, a vacuum is not a quiet place. It is a violent summoning. It calls to the ambitious, the hungry, and the ruthless. While the king huddled in his filth, terrified of the touch of his own robes, the corridors of the Hotel St. Paul began to echo with the footsteps of wolves walking on two legs. Foremost among them was Louis, the Duke of Orleans. He was the king's younger brother, the man who had held the torch at the Bal des Ardents, the man whose carelessness had turned a masquerade into a massacre. One might expect such a tragedy to break a man, to drive him into a monastery of silent penance. But Louis was not made of glass, he was made of quicksilver. He was charming, intelligent, and terrifyingly arrogant. He possessed the vitality that his brother had lost. While Charles withered, Louis bloomed. He dressed in velvets dyed the color of midnight and blood, embroidered with the motto, "I challenge." He was a golden idol built on the ashes of his brother's sanity. Louis looked at the empty eyes of the king and saw an opportunity. He moved into the center of the court, not as a usurper, but as a regent by necessity. He took the reins of government with hands that were manicured and ringed with jewels. He dipped those hands deep into the royal treasury. While the king's household fell into disrepair, servants unpaid, tapestries rotting on the walls, Louis lived in a splendor that dazzled and enraged the populace. He held jousts. He commissioned poets. He bought castles. He was the Shadow King, ruling a twilight court where pleasure was the only law. But Louis was not the only creature circling the throne. There was the Queen. Isabeau of Bavaria is one of history's great orphans, a woman maligned by centuries of propaganda, painted as a creature of excess and infidelity. But strip away the slander of her enemies, and you find a woman in a desperate struggle for survival. She was a foreigner, a German princess in a French court that viewed her with suspicion. She was the wife of a man who no longer recognized her, a man who screamed in terror when she entered the room. She was alone in a nest of vipers, with only her wits to protect her children. Isabeau realized quickly that a queen without a king is merely a pawn. She needed a protector. She needed an ally who could wield the sword that her husband had dropped. And so, she turned to the only man powerful enough to hold back the tide of the uncles, Louis of Orleans. It was an alliance born of necessity, but it was forged in the intimate, hushed corners of the palace. The queen and the king's brother became inseparable. They dined together, they governed together, they stood side by side at court, a wall of unity against the encroaching ambition of the Duke of Burgundy. But intimacy in a court is never just political. Whispers began to drift through the galleries like drafts of cold air. They spoke of late-night visits. They spoke of shared carriages. They spoke of a relationship that transgressed the boundaries of kinship and duty. Did they share a bed? History keeps its bedroom doors locked, but the truth of the flesh matters less than the truth of the perception. To the people of Paris, starving and overtaxed, seeing the queen and the duke draped in gold while the beloved king rotted in his room was an insult. The propaganda machine of the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, a man as cold and hard as his name implies, began to churn. He painted Louis as a lecherous sorcerer, and Isabeau as a she-wolf, a woman who had abandoned her sick husband to wallow in sin with his brother. The scandal became a contagion. It seeped out of the palace gates and into the taverns and markets of Paris. The people, who still held a fierce, protective love for their broken king, began to hate the queen and the duke. They saw Isabeau not as a victim of circumstance, but as a traitor to the crown. They whispered that the king's madness was not a sickness, but a curse brought on by the sins of his wife. They whispered that the Duke of Orleans was using sorcery to keep his brother weak. binding him with spells so he could steal the kingdom piece by piece. In the midst of this toxicity, a dangerous geometry formed. The triangle of power, the mad king, the foreign queen, and the ambitious brother, was unstable. It was a structure built on secrets and resentment. And watching it teeter was the fourth player, the man who would bring the whole edifice crashing down, John the Fearless. John, the new Duke of Burgundy, was the antithesis of Louis. Where Louis was silk and poetry, John was iron and silence. He was a man of the north, wealthy, pragmatic, and ruthless. He saw the alliance between Isabeau and Louis not as a romance but as a theft. They were stealing his influence. They were stealing his taxes. He began to position himself as the champion of the people, the defender of the true king against the corrupt regents. He walked the streets of Paris without guards, shaking hands with butchers and bakers, listening to their grievances, promising them that he would break the grip of the Orleans faction. The tension in Paris grew thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. The nobles chose sides. You were either an Armagnac supporting Orleans or a Burgundian. To wear the wrong color sash in the wrong neighborhood was to invite a knife in the ribs. The king, in his rare moments of clarity, would look out his window and see the fires of factionalism burning in the city. He would call for his wife, then banish her. He would embrace his brother, then accuse him. He was a weather vane spinning in a hurricane, unable to find true north. And through it all, Isabeau stood in the eye of the storm. She bore the king's children, 12 in total, though death claimed many, even as the rumors questioned their paternity. She managed the treasury when the king could not hold a pen. She navigated a court where a smile could be a weapon and a whisper could be a death sentence. She was fighting for the survival of the Valois dynasty, but to the world she looked like a woman picking the pockets of a corpse. The glass was no longer just inside the king. It was everywhere. The alliances were brittle. The peace was transparently thin. And one night, on a dark street in the Marais district, the first stone would be thrown that would shatter it all. Chapter 6. The Civil War of the Mind. If the king was a mirror reflecting the soul of France, then on November 23, 1407, the hammer finally fell. The tension that had been coiling in the streets of Paris, the whispers, the propaganda, the silent sharpening of knives, snapped with a violence that would stain the cobblestones for a generation. It was a Wednesday evening, cold and bitter, the kind of night where the fog from the Seine creeps into the marrow. Louis, the Duke of Orleans, had been dining with the Queen at her residence, the Hotel Barbet. He left shortly after 8 o'clock, humming a tune, wrapped in a cloak of black damask, riding a mule. He was attended by only a few squires and pages carrying torches. He felt safe. He was the brother of the king. He was the lover of the Queen. He was untouchable. He turned onto the Rue Ville du Temple, a narrow artery in the dark heart of the Marais. The shadows there were deep, pooled between the high walls of the houses. Suddenly, the darkness moved. A group of men, perhaps 15 or 20, burst from the cover of a draper's shop. They were not thieves, they were executioners. They surrounded the Duke, swinging axes and swords with a professional, mute ferocity. "Stop!" Louis cried out, raising a hand in imperious command. "I am the Duke of Orleans." A voice from the dark, cold and devoid of mercy, replied, "That is exactly who we want." The first blow severed the Duke's hand. The hand that had signed treaties, caressed the Queen, and dipped into the treasury. The second blow split his skull. They dragged him from his mule and hacked him to pieces in the mud. It was not a murder, it was a butchery. They scattered his brains on the stones. They left him a broken, bloody heap, barely recognizable as the man who, hours before, had been the Shadow King of France. The torches were extinguished. The assassins vanished into the labyrinth of the city, leaving only the smoking silence of the crime. When the news reached the Hotel St. Paul, the effect was cataclysmic. Charles VI was in one of his fragile periods of lucidity. He was told that his brother, his rival, his tormentor, his blood, was dead. The king did not shatter, he crumbled. He wept with the raw, confused grief of a child. He ordered the court to mourn. But while the king wept, Paris held its breath. who had dared to strike down the second most powerful man in the realm. 2 days later, at a council meeting, the answer walked through the door. John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, stood before the princes of the blood. He was pale but steady. He did not offer an alibi. He looked his cousin, the Duke of Anjou, in the eye and said, "I did it. The devil tempted me." It was a confession that should have led to the scaffold, but John knew his audience. He knew that Paris hated the Duke of Orleans. He knew the people saw Louis as a tyrant and a sorcerer. And so John did not flee. He hired a theologian from the Sorbonne, Jean Petit, to deliver a sermon justifying the murder. Petit argued that Louis was a tyrant and that tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrant, was not a sin but a holy duty. He painted John the Fearless not as Cain, but as Saint Michael slaying the dragon. The king, trapped in the oscillating rhythm of his madness, was powerless to punish the murderer. One day he would hug John and forgive him. The next he would scream for justice for his brother. He was a judge with no gavel, a monarch whose decrees were written on water. And in the absence of royal justice, the kingdom turned to the justice of the sword. Justice denied is a wound that never heals. It only festers until the rot consumes the whole body. With the king unable to condemn the murderer, the blood of Louis of Orleans cried out from the ground, and it was answered not by the law but by a counter-curse. The dead duke's son, Charles of Orleans, was a poet, a man of gentle verses, but he was forced to trade his quill for a sword. He married the daughter of the Count of Armagnac, a ferocious nobleman from the south whose name became the rallying cry for vengeance. The Armagnacs. Now the fracture in the king's mind was mapped onto the geography of France. On one side stood the Burgundians, the populists, the masters of Paris, the butchers and the merchants led by John the Fearless, wearing hoods of blue and displaying the red cross of St. Andrew. On the other stood the Armagnacs, the aristocrats, the fierce loyalists of the Orleans line, wearing white sashes and the white cross of France. Paris became a chessboard where the pieces bled. The civil war of the Armagnacs and Burgundians was not a war of open fields and chivalric charges. It was a war of alleyways, of doors kicked down at midnight, of bodies floating down the Seine like driftwood. The butchers of Paris, the Cabochians, allied with Burgundy and turned the city into a slaughterhouse. They hunted Armagnacs through the streets with the same cleavers they used on cattle. They stormed the palaces. They dragged nobles from their beds and executed them on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. And where was the king? He was the ghost in the machine. Charles VI sat in the Hôtel St. Paul, drifting between the shores of sanity and the ocean of his delusion. When the Armagnacs held the city, they placed a pen in his trembling hand and made him sign decrees declaring John the Fearless a traitor. When the Burgundians stormed the gates and took control, they placed the same pen in the same hand and made him sign decrees declaring the Armagnacs enemies of the state. He was a ventriloquist's dummy, speaking with two voices, authorizing his own destruction. In his moments of clarity, the tragedy was absolute. He would wake from his stupor to find his capital burning, the sky choked with the smoke of civil war. He would ask for his wife, only to be told she had fled. He would ask for his friends, only to be told they were dead. "Alas," he would weep, "I would that I were dead, for I am the cause of all this misery." He saw the glass shards of his kingdom scattered across the floor, and he knew, with a terrible, lucid heartbreak, that he had no glue to put them back together. The irony was cruel. The king who believed he was made of glass was the only thing that didn't break. He survived the plagues. He survived the poisons. He survived the riots that swirled around his palace walls. He remained whole while everything he loved, his brother, his honor, his peace, shattered into dust. He was the eye of the hurricane, the silent, terrifyingly fragile center around which the fury of France spun itself into exhaustion. But while the wolves of France tore at each other's throats, a lion was watching from across the sea. He saw the divided house. He saw the mad king, and he began to sharpen his claws. Chapter 7: The English Tide. While France was busy eating its own heart, a cold wind began to blow from the north. It carried the scent of salt, wet wool, and old ambition. Across the narrow gray channel that separates the island from the continent, a new king sat on the throne of England. Henry V was not a creature of glass, nor was he a man of divided loyalties. He was a monolith. Young, scarred from battle, and possessed of a pious, terrifying certainty, he looked at the map of France and saw not a neighbor but a birthright stolen. He saw the reports from his spies in Paris. He read of the madness of Charles VI, the debauchery of Queen Isabeau, the bloody feud between Burgundy and Armagnac. He saw a kingdom with no head, a body thrashing in a seizure. And in 1415, he decided it was time to put the animal out of its misery. The English invasion was not a subtle affair. It was a methodical dismemberment. Henry landed at Harfleur with a massive army, siege engines, and the grim determination of a surgeon. He took the town, though dysentery took a tithe of his men. Then, in a display of calculated arrogance, he marched his depleted force across the French countryside, daring the French nobility to stop him. He was walking through a burning house, knowing the occupants were too busy fighting each other to extinguish the flames. The French response was a tragic comedy of ego. The Constable of France summoned the chivalry of the realm. They came in their thousands, dukes, counts, barons, glittering in plate armor, their banners snapping in the autumn wind. They outnumbered the English 5-1. But they were not an army, they were a mob of aristocrats, each desperate for glory, each refusing to take orders from a rival faction. They were Armagnacs who hated Burgundians more than they hated the English. And the king? The king was not there. Charles VI was in Paris, drifting in the fog, perhaps believing himself to be a stained glass window in a cathedral, while the fate of his dynasty was decided in a muddy field near a village called Agincourt. On October 25, 1415, the sky wept. The field was a churned soup of clay and water. The French knights, weighed down by 60 pounds of steel, looked across the wet earth at the English line, a thin ribbon of archers standing behind sharpened stakes. It should have been a massacre, and it was, but not the one the French expected. The French charged. It was a slow, sucking charge into the mud. The English longbows sang their terrible, high-pitched song. The arrows fell like iron rain, punching through visors, pinning thighs to saddles. The flower of French nobility floundered in the mire, crushed by the weight of their own numbers, suffocated in the mud, battered to death by common archers wielding mallets. The Duke of Orleans, the poet's son of the murdered Louis, was pulled from under a pile of corpses and taken prisoner. The Duke of Brabant arrived late, donned a herald's tabard, and was cut down. In a single afternoon, a generation of French leadership was wiped out. 10,000 French dead. The English lost barely a few hundred. It was not just a defeat, it was a decapitation. When the news reached Paris, Charles VI was reportedly playing cards. The courtiers who brought the message trembled as they spoke of the slaughter. They told him that his kingdom was broken. They told him that the English wolf was no longer at the door but in the parlor. Charles looked at them with his wide, vacant eyes. Did he understand? Did he feel the phantom pain of 10,000 souls leaving the earth? Or did he simply fear that the news was too loud, that the vibration of their grief would crack his chest? "It is the will of God," he might have murmured, retreating back into his silence. But the silence was no longer a shield. The English tide was rising, and there was no one left to build a dike. Henry V marched on. He took Caen. He took Rouen. He swallowed Normandy whole. And finally he turned his eyes toward the greatest prize of all, the crown itself. Chapter 8. The Disownd Sun. If Agincourt was the death of French chivalry, then what followed was the death of French honor. The years after the battle were a slow, suffocating slide into chaos. The king was a husk, shuffling through the corridors of the Hotel St. Paul, oblivious to the fact that his kingdom was being partitioned like a loaf of bread. But the final blow to the Valois dynasty did not come from an English arrow. It came from a French knife on a bridge in Montereau. In 1419, the Dauphin Charles, the king's last surviving son, a boy of 16 with nervous eyes and a tenuous grasp on courage, attempted to do what his father could not. He tried to unite the factions. He arranged a meeting with John the Fearless on the bridge of Montereau, ostensibly to forge a peace against the English. But the ghosts of the past were also invited to the parley. As the Duke of Burgundy knelt before the prince, the Dauphin's men, Armagnac hardliners who remembered the butchery of Louis of Orleans, drew their axes. They hacked John the Fearless to death on the wooden planks. It was a blunder of monumental proportions. By killing the Duke, the Dauphin did not kill the Burgundian faction, he radicalized it. Philip the Good, the new Duke of Burgundy, wanted only one thing: the destruction of the man who killed his father. He turned his back on France and opened his arms to Henry V. The alliance was sealed. Paris, Burgundy, and England stood united against the so-called Dauphin. And so the stage was set for the darkest hour of the Glass King's reign, the Treaty of Troyes. The year is 1420. The city of Troyes is decked in flags, but the mood is funereal. Inside the cathedral, a document waits on a table. It is a piece of parchment that defies the laws of nature, for it is designed to turn a French river into an English stream. It declares that Henry V of England is the regent of France and the heir to the throne. It declares that upon the death of Charles VI, the two kingdoms will be forever united under the English crown. And most cruelly, it declares that the Dauphin Charles, the king's own flesh and blood, is a bastard, a murderer, and stripped of all rights to the succession. Charles VI is brought into the cathedral. He is 60 years old now, prematurely aged, his hair white, his skin translucent. He looks like a saint carved from wax. He does not understand the complexities of the legal Latin scrawled on the page. He sees only faces: the stern, hard face of Henry V, the cold, pragmatic face of his wife, Queen Isabeau, the angry face of Philip of Burgundy. They guide him to the table. They place the quill in his hand. "Sign, Charles," they whisper, "for peace, for rest." The king's hand trembles. Does he know? In the deep, silent recesses of his mind, does he realize that he is erasing his son? Does he feel the glass shattering in his chest? Or is he simply afraid that if he refuses, the stern man in the iron armor will hurt him? He lowers the quill. The scratch of the nib is the sound of a dynasty ending. Charles R. With that signature, Charles VI became the only king in history to disinherit his own line. He gave his daughter, Catherine of Valois, to Henry V in marriage, sealing the pact with a wedding that felt more like a funeral for France. The English king kissed the French princess, and the courtiers bowed to their new master. Charles VI was left sitting in his chair, a king in name only, a relic displayed for the legitimacy of the conqueror. The Dauphin, now a fugitive in his own land, fled south to Bourges. He was mocked as the King of Bourges, a pathetic figure ruling a rump state of vineyards and despair. His mother had disowned him. His father had signed him away. The Glass King had finally broken, and the shards had cut the cord that bound the past to the future. Chapter 9: The Silent Death. History has a dark sense of humor, often delivering its punchlines at the edge of the grave. The Treaty of Troyes was meant to settle the fate of France for 1,000 years. It was built on the assumption that Henry V, the young, iron-willed warrior, would outlive the frail, shattered Charles VI. It was a safe bet. Henry was 35, a man of oak and gristle. Charles was 53, a man of glass and shadows. But death does not read treaties. In August 1422, the conqueror fell. Henry V, the scourge of France, died not by the sword but by the bowels, dysentery contracted during the siege of Meaux. He died leaving behind an infant son, a 9-month-old baby to inherit 2 crowns. The English lion was gone, and back in Paris, the Glass King sat in his room, unaware that his heir was dead, unaware that the geopolitical map had just been rewritten by a microbe. Charles VI lingered for 2 more months. His final days were a masterclass in abandonment. The court, sensing the end, had largely evaporated, chasing the favor of the English regent, the Duke of Bedford. The Hotel St. Paul, once the vibrant stage of the Bal des Ardents, was now a tomb of dust and echoes. The king lay in a bed with soiled sheets, attended by only a handful of loyal servants. There were no great speeches. There were no lucid revelations. The glass did not shatter with a spectacular crash. It simply grew clouded, then dark. On October 21, 1422, Charles VI exhaled for the final time. The beloved, the mad, the Glass King, he slipped away in the quiet of the early morning. It is said that when he died, he was not raving, he was calm. Perhaps in that final moment, the terrifying tension that had held his body together for 30 years finally released. He was no longer fragile, he was merely gone. The funeral was a somber, haunting affair that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of his coronation. Paris was a city of ghosts, ravaged by occupation, famine, and wolves that literally prowled the streets at night. The people lined the route of the procession, gaunt and silent. When they saw the coffin, they did not cheer for the English victory. They wept. They wept for the beloved boy who had promised them a golden age and given them a century of ash. They wept because, despite the madness, despite the taxes, despite the civil war, he was their king. He was the last link to a France that belonged to the French. At Saint-Denis, the royal necropolis, the coffin was lowered into the vault. The herald of France stepped forward. He did not cry out, "Long live King Charles VII," for the Dauphin had been disinherited. Instead, his voice rang out with the terrible, treasonous words dictated by the Treaty of Troyes. "God grant long life to Henry, by the grace of God, King of France and England." It was the nadir of the nation. A dead madman was succeeded by an English baby. The stained glass window of the Valois monarchy had been smashed, and the pieces were being swept away by foreign brooms. Chapter 10. The Shards of History. When a mirror shatters, it does not cease to reflect. It merely reflects the world in 1,000 fragmented, jagged angles. The death of Charles VI left France in a state of shattered reality. The North belonged to the English infant, Henry VI. The South belonged to the disinherited Dauphin, Charles VII, a young man paralyzing in his indecision, haunted by the madness of his father and the cold rejection of his mother. For 7 years, the King of Bourges sat in his makeshift court, too afraid to fight, too poor to rule, watching the English wolves consume what was left of his inheritance. The story of the Glass King should have ended there, a tragedy of a broken mind leading to a broken nation. But history, unlike glass, can be melted down and recast. From the ashes of the Valois despair, a spark emerged that no one predicted. She did not come from the nobility. She did not come from the church. She came from the mud of Domremy, Joan of Arc. We cannot tell the story of the father's madness without whispering the name of the son's savior. She was the antithesis of Charles VI. Where he was fragile, she was iron. Where he was plagued by demons, she was guided by saints. She rode to the Dauphin not with a physician's cure, but with a prophet's certainty. She took the shards of the army and forged them into a weapon. In 1429, she marched to Orleans and broke the English siege. She dragged the reluctant, terrified Charles VII to Reims, the very cathedral where the Glass King had been crowned amid such hope 50 years prior, and placed the crown on his head. It was the healing of the wound. The dynasty that Charles VI had signed away in his madness was restored by a peasant girl in armor. Charles VII, the bastard, became Charles the Victorious. He drove the English into the sea. He rebuilt the state. He ended the Civil War, but he never visited his father's grave. The memory of the Glass King was a ghost he spent his entire life trying to exorcise. What then is the true legacy of Charles VI? We can look at him through the cold lens of modern medicine. We can diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or porphyria. We can label the Glass Delusion as a psychiatric anomaly, a footnote in a medical textbook. But to do so is to miss the poetic horror of his existence. Charles VI was not just a sick man. He was a living metaphor for the state he ruled. The medieval mind believed that the king was the kingdom. His body was the body politic. When Charles felt himself turning to glass, he was feeling the structural integrity of feudalism failing. He felt the brittle nature of alliances that could snap in an instant. He felt the transparent, fragile barrier that separates peace from war, order from chaos, civilization from savagery. He was not wrong to fear the touch of the world. The world did shatter him. The world did break him into pieces, Armagnac, Burgundian, English. There is a profound, terrifying wisdom in the madness of the Glass King. We build our lives, our nations, and our identities out of stone and steel, believing them to be permanent. But Charles VI knew the secret. He knew that beneath the armor, beneath the velvet, beneath the titles, we are all made of silica and breath. We are all one bad fall, one stray spark, one moment of terror away from shattering. The corridors of the Louvre are silent now. The Hotel St. Paul is gone, plowed under by the march of centuries. But sometimes when the wind blows through the streets of Paris, you can almost hear the faint, crystalline sound of a man trembling in the dark, whispering to the shadows, "Do not touch me. I am fragile." The glass is broken, but the light still catches the edges.